Hi, welcome to the lecture on software processes, part 2. The agenda for the day is as follows. We start with discussing what is process flow, then how to define a framework activity, and the software process patterns. We start with the software process structure. So, what is a process? How do you define a process? We have already discussed all of these things, so it is a quick recap. A process is defined as a collection of work activities, actions, and tasks that are performed when some work product is to be created. Each of these activities and tasks will reside within a framework or a model, and basically it will define the relationship with the process and with one another. Is process synonymous with software engineering? If this is the question, you can always argue for both for and against, which states as yes and no. A software process defines the approach that is taken as software is engineered. But software engineering also encompasses technologies that populate the process, like the methods and automated tools. It is also important to note that software engineering is performed by creative, knowledgeable people who should adapt a mature software process so that it is appropriate for products that they build and the demands of the marketplace. If you look into the software process framework, so each framework activity is populated by a set of actions. Each action is defined by a task set. So you will probably identify the work tasks to be completed, the work products that will be produced, the QA points that will be needed, and milestones used to indicate the progress. So if you look into the GPF or the generic process framework for software engineering that encompasses 5 activities, what are they? This is again a quick recap. It starts with communication, it proceeds to planning, modeling, construction, and deployment. What do you think are the typical umbrella activities that are involved in software engineering? So, in general, typical umbrella activities include software project tracking and control, risk management, SQA, technical reviews, measurement, SCM, reusability management, work product preparation and management. So you might be aware of what is an umbrella activity. An umbrella activity is applied throughout the project, and these different umbrella activities will help the team manage and control the progress, the quality, the change, and risks involved in the project. If you look into the generic process model, there is a specific process flow. What is a process flow? The process flow basically describes how the framework activities, actions, and tasks occur within each activity and how they are organized with respect to the sequence and time. So based on this, we have different process flows. To start with, we have something called the linear process flow. The linear process flow, as the name indicates, executes each of the 5 different framework activities in a sequence. So it starts with communication and ends with deployment. That probably goes in a linear fashion. The next is called iterative process flow. As the term indicates, iterative is looping, so it repeats one or more activities before proceeding to the next. It basically repeats after getting due feedback and then taking appropriate action on the feedback. The next one is called the evolutionary process flow. In the case of an evolutionary process flow, the activities are executed in a circular manner. So, as each circuit is completed, it will lead to more complete versions of the software. The next one is called the parallel process flow. This basically executes the activities in parallel with other activities. As you could see with this diagram, so communication and planning go in hand, followed by modeling, followed by construction and deployment. So when you want to define a framework activity, what are the basic actions that are appropriate for the activity given the nature of the problem to be solved, characteristics of people doing the work, and stakeholders sponsoring the project. So this will basically depend on the size of the project. For example, if you look at what is called a small project is the one that might be requested by one person at a remote location. The project is going to be simple in nature, the requirements are all straightforward, and the communication is going to be a very simple phone call or an email with the concerned stakeholder. So what you basically do is the necessary action is a phone conversation, and the task set basically looks like this. Make a contact with the stakeholder via telephone, discuss the requirements, write notes, organize the notes into a brief written statement of requirements, and then email the same to the stakeholder for review and approval. This is going to be very simple if the size of the project is small. If in case the size of the project is large and it's going to be a complex project, so when I say complex in terms of size, where there are many stakeholders involved and each of these stakeholders will obviously have what are called conflicting requirements, then the communication activity will have 6 distinct actions, right from inception to elicitation, elaboration, negotiation, specification, and validation. We will see them in detail later. Each of these actions would have many work tasks and a number of distinct work products. So when you go for identifying a task set, this is a sample output where I make a list of stakeholders for the project, interview each stakeholder separately, have a preliminary list with me, then I schedule a series of meetings, I conduct meetings, then I have informal discussions where I come up with user scenarios, then I go for refining them based on the feedback, then I come up with a revised list, then I talk of the QFD, the quality function, deployment, and this is basically helpful to prioritize the requirements. Then I package them so that I'm going to go for an incremental delivery. And if you work on all of these things, you should always remember that there are certain constraints and restrictions on the system. And also we need to discuss methods for validating the system as well. So when you look at the generic view of the process, you have something called the process pattern. What is a process pattern? A pattern is a template, no doubt. So what is a process pattern? You are given with a template. So what does the template do? This will give you a consistent method for describing problem solutions within the context of a software process. So when you look at a process pattern, so this will basically identify the environment in which the problem is encountered and then obviously need to suggest one or more proven solutions to the problem. And I go for the best one obviously after suitable discussion. So what we basically do is by combining patterns, a team can solve problems and construct a process that will best meet the needs of the project. So these kind of patterns can be defined at any level of abstraction ranging from low to high. For instance, a pattern might be used to describe a problem and solution obviously associated with a complete process model. For instance, we call it as the prototyping. In certain other cases, we would be discussing with respect to a very specific action in a framework activity. For example, project estimation and so on. So that is what it is mentioned that you can probably define it at varying levels of abstraction. The next obvious question is why process patterns are necessary. So process patterns might provide an effective mechanism for addressing problems associated with the process. So this will enable us to develop a hierarchical process description that always begins at a higher level of abstraction. So anything that is basically defined at a higher level of abstraction is called a phase pattern. Then we go for refining them into a set of stage patterns that basically describes the framework activities. So that is what is called a staged pattern. Then once you probably develop the process patterns, we can obviously reuse it for multiple process variants. So what we basically talk of here is a customized model that can be defined by a team using the patterns, and these patterns will basically serve as the building blocks for the process model. So obviously it is required that you have a very specific and common template that could be used for probably describing a process pattern. So the template basically starts with a pattern name where you could probably give any meaningful name that basically describes, in what context probably the pattern is defined. The next is called the forces. The forces is basically talking of what is called the environment in which the pattern is encountered, the issues that make the problem visible, and anything that could probably affect its solution. The next one is the type. As I mentioned, there are three types. Basically starts with staged pattern that basically defines a problem associated with a framework activity. So I could say a simple example is establishing communication as a staged pattern. Then I have something called the task pattern that basically is associated with an action or a work task. For example, requirements gathering is a task pattern. Then comes the phase pattern. The phase pattern basically defines the sequence of activities that occur within the process, and an example is something like a spiral model or prototyping. The next one is called the initial context. So initial context basically describes the condition under which the pattern is applied. So, for example, the planning pattern requires customers and engineers to have a collaborative communication. Successful completion of a number of task patterns has occurred, and the project scope, the business requirements and constraints are known. Yeah, so this is what is the initial context. So before you begin, what are the conditions that need to be satisfied, something like a prerequisite. The next is the problem, the very specific problem that is basically used, for which the solution is required. The next one is the solution, that basically describes how to implement the pattern in a successful manner. The next one is called the resulting context. So here it describes the conditions that will result once the pattern is successfully implemented. The next one is called the related patterns. So we could obviously go look at a list of all process patterns that are directly related to this one. Something like collaborative guidelines, the team, requirements gathering, scenario creation, and so on. Then we talk of known uses and examples. So here it basically talks of specific instances in which the pattern is applicable. For example, communication is mandatory at the beginning of every software project. So if I would like to put the template in a nutshell, it basically talks of 9 different things, right from pattern name, the forces, the type, the initial context, the problem, its associated solution, the resulting context, related patterns, known uses and examples. So a quick summary of what we have learned in this video lecture. A generic process model for software engineering basically comprises of a set of framework and umbrella activities, actions, and work tasks. Each of a variety of process models can be defined and described by very specific process flows, like linear and so on. A generic process model for software engineering basically also is used to solve common problems that are encountered as part of the software process. So thank you, and this concludes the software process part 2, and stay tuned for more lectures on further concepts in software engineering. Thank you once again.